Good afternoon on this first day of fall. We are just waiting for the rest of the panel to come out. There's a little jam back there. But it's an honor to be here to speak about a topic that is not just pertinent to those who've changed careers, but to those who are redefining the fields that they're in and are going through transformations and expansions at all times. So if the rest of the panel could join me, we'll have Rachel Sklar, Aimee Mullins, and Dambisa Moyo here. Great. Okay. Thank you. Great. So, I want to be mindful of our time because we have some dynamite leaders here to speak about this topic of reinvention. So I'm going to introduce them briefly and speak a little bit about the topic of reinvention and then open it up to a conversation between all of us and then questions from you at the end. So we have first on my right, Dambisa Moyo, who is someone, when I read her first New York Times bestseller, and she's written 3, I saw her as an economist and a former consultant to the World Bank who was not just redefining what it meant to speak truth to power, but was really redefining the entire field of economic development, saying what had long gone unsaid, which is that after 60 years of economic development in sub-Saharan Africa, there really has been no progress and things have become worse. So I thank you for being a truth teller and looking forward to your comments. Yeah. And we have here next to her Aimee Mullins, excuse me, who is an athlete, a model, and a global ambassador for luxury brands like L'Oreal and others, and the Tribeca Film Festival and others. And she really redefines in a powerful way, I think, the notion of just what identity looks like and how it can lead to a form of empowerment for those in many different positions in life. And we'll speak about how you do that in all different ways and all different walks. And then we have Rachel Sklar, who is a dynamite former lawyer turned tech media guru who has really spearheaded and co-founded the Li.st and Change the Ratio. And we'll speak today about the way in which you're redefining how the sphere of technology looks in terms of maybe gender and other forms of identity. The topic, though, of reinvention, I think, oftentimes is considered just one about change, just change alone. But I tend to think that it's broader than that, and it's maybe even deeper than that. I think reinvention oftentimes means that you really can become who you were all along through a choice of a change in a career or a re-intensification of your mission. And oftentimes in becoming who you are, you inspire others to shift out of their models and to discover something new or pioneer a new field or redefine a field. But it takes a level of fortitude and wisdom and curiosity and courageousness, I think, to do this. And to become all of who you are, I think, is a difficult thing. And I think it's why I love that Thelonious Monk once said, and I'll put it in female terms, he said, "A genius is she who is most herself." And here I think we have women who are empowered in finding who they fully are through redefining the positions that they can occupy. And all of us in this room do that in different ways, but we only do it powerfully when we reflect from one another what it can look like in action. So today I'd love for us to speak a bit about what that has looked like for the 3 of you. I'd like to open first with a question for Aimee, as someone who really has redefined what reinvention can look like. I wonder if you can speak to us a bit about how language hasn't really fully caught up with the definition of, say, disability or empowerment in your mind.
Sure. Yeah, language, I mean, certainly in the realm of disability, there's the heavy veil of political correctness, but that doesn't usually address the underlying issues of still disparity in basic civil rights. And that's where I find, in the research that I've done on this in the last couple of years, there's real parallels to racial integration and gender integration in sports and in our media, and like the way we talk about people. I mean, it was only in the 80s that there was a famous memo had to be circulated in the New York Times, around the New York Times, about to cease the use of the word articulate when describing someone who is African American. It was like, the implication that other people aren't articulate. It was just something that people took for granted, and that's kind of how I know for me. Growing up wearing prosthetic legs, I knew that it was a physical trait and it made me different than the other kids in my class, but it was like the girl in my class who had big frizzy red hair, or somebody. It was a characteristic and not an identity, and it wasn't until my late teens when I had found fame as an athlete, and really in many ways was not ready for what was happening to me, and that I had just wanted to be, Aimee. I mean, I just didn't want to be with the girl with the legs. And then I was sprinting. I was the first person in the world on these legs that are modeled after the hind leg of a cheetah, which are now the standard for any amputee running and are pretty well known. But at the time, 16 years ago, it was a pretty lonely place to live in and to feel really objectified. I was inviting people to look in a way that I had kind of hoped they wouldn't up until that point. And then luckily in a few years I had caught up with that and was happy for people to look. But it was a magazine cover that said, "Disabled athlete Aimee Mullins runs faster than you can." And I called the editor and I was like, "Well, then why am I disabled?" And she's like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "Well, it's factual to say that I'm an amputee, but have you ever looked up that word?" Which I hadn't until recently. And if you look it up, it's pretty shocking. The synonyms in the thesaurus, it's like useless, wrecked, maimed, lame, impotent, senile, wrecked, done in, done up, done for, counted out. And I thought it was just, that was my thesaurus from the 80s, that I had from elementary school. But actually, if you look it up today, it hasn't really changed. In fact, the antonyms are able and whole and wholesome are the antonyms of disabled. So I find that profound when we casually tell a parent whose child might have a learning disability, or you are learning, the fact that we expect people to take on an identity of a pathology that creates far more of a problem, I think, than the pathology itself. So, and I feel like when I look at shows like Mad Men, and I realize this was exactly what women experienced as a category en masse, even 50 years ago. Where the progress we've made from a gender and from racial and ethnic perspective, disability is still where we were 60 years ago in those perspectives.
No, thank you. It's a powerful discussion. I wonder if this discussion about racial and gender equity and change and looking at kind of pathology as identity is something that resonates for you, Dambisa, in part because your work has pointed out the characterization of Africa through the focus on the negative lens that it's often portrayed through because of debt and aid. Could you speak about what inspired you to speak out about this and to write about it so forcefully?
So thank you very much. And Aimee, it's fascinating listening to you because I see so much of a reflection in my own life that there's this predilection, particularly in the Western media, to pigeonhole you. So you're either black or you're white, or you're Republican or Democratic, or you're African, and and therefore you have a sort of prescribed baggage as you come into a particular debate. In my particular instance, first of all, I didn't have some big grand plan that, was sitting around saying, oh gosh, I want to become an author. It happened quite accidentally. And in terms of, I have lots of sort of lessons learned, and I think, just again, listening to what Aimee was saying, I wanted to be known as an economist. I spent a heck of a lot of time doing my PhD at Oxford, studying at Harvard to do my master's, and it was a lot of grind. And yet I learned tools that were, tools that any economist was aware of. And a lot of the way I approached the question of aid to Africa was with the lens of, sort of, I mentioned to you earlier, appealing to reason, appealing to people's logic and reason. If it really were the case that aid was so important for economic development, why is it the case that in the history of the world there's not a single country that has achieved economic growth and reduced poverty by relying on aid to the extent that Africa does today? Why is it that 300 years after the Industrial Revolution, we know in many ways as economists and policymakers what drives economic growth? We know that trade is important. We know that foreign direct investment is important. And yet, when it comes to Africa, there was this sort of, interest and a keenness to characterize Africa and Africans in what I call the four horsemen of Africa's apocalypse. They wanted to focus on war and disease, poverty and corruption. And there was absolutely nothing positive in terms of the way the Africa, certainly, that I grew up in. And I've really resisted, I wouldn't say I've been successful at it, but I've definitely resisted the reason why this is important is because you're a black woman from Africa. There are many other people, in fact, my book was dedicated to Peter Bauer, who was, Hungarian white male, who had argued very logically about why it was that aid wouldn't work. More recently, William Easterly, a professor here in New York, has also very articulately, if I may use the word, made the case for why it is the aid policy is defective, and not just sort of innocuous. It was actually detrimental to economic growth. But I did meet with Bill Easterly, who's a fantastic mind, and like me had spent time at the World Bank, but on the global stage, and invariably, and by the way, I met him after my book came out, so I had never met him before, but it was interesting to see what happened to him when he published his book, basically quite in very much in the same vein of my own arguments and why it was, from a political and economic standpoint, aid doesn't work. And he got absolutely annihilated. And there was this view, nobody wanted to talk about the main arguments and logic. It was all about emotive stuff that was baseless and wrong. There are more poor people in China than there are in Africa, more poor people in India than there are in Africa, but somehow the media and the sort of sentiment had grown up around the fact, or this idea that we should feel sorry or have pity for Africans. And completely by serendipity, my book was published I guess it must have been 18 months, maybe 2 years after Bill's book, and it was incredibly infuriating for me that a lot of people said, oh, well, I got aggressive things like, oh, she's going to kill off Africans because of her arguments. Somehow, that was my agenda. But, there was this preference to constantly say, oh, no, the only reason her arguments make sense is because she's a young African woman. So I said, well, okay, so wait a second. So you're saying when I get older, somehow the logic is going to fall away. And I realized that rather than spend my time arguing that point, all I could do was make the arguments that I think are couched in logic and fact. But the last thing I would say about it is that, interestingly enough, the people who are incredibly pro-aid, a lot of the celebrities, some people who will remain nameless but are quite obvious in terms of people who are just creating a career for themselves on the back of sort of a ruinous life for hundreds of millions of Africans, they are not willing to debate with us in public, us meaning people like myself or Bill Easterly, because they know that on logic and evidence we have the upper hand. And the only things that they can throw at us are ad hominem attacks. It's because she's an African, because she's a woman, she's an educated African, therefore she doesn't understand what it's like to be a poor African. Well, I'll tell you what, my experience, I was born in Africa, in Zambia. I went to primary, secondary, and university in my country. I've been sick in an African hospital. So the notion that people who are unelected, have spent maybe 2 weeks in Africa on holiday and safari, or maybe have gone in for some conference, would have better information about what it's like to have girls' education in Africa, which I've gone through. It was absurd. But the press and the media love to create this split. And I might just close by saying that I think it's very much a reflection of what the public wants. People don't want to question some of the most absurd things that are going on in the world. They just prefer to live in the comfort that they do.
Absolutely. Before asking you a question, Rachel, I must just say, first, I've spent, I guess, the last 18 months of my life finishing a book, a chapter of which is dedicated to much of the work that your own arguments expose, and it's really focused on Engineers Without Borders and the Admitting Failure movement, to look at the ways in which people are showing more transparency about how actually these very same measures that for 60 years have not been working. And I've found some encouragement in people actually being more forthcoming about that, but it's oftentimes a lot of Canadian organizations, not yet here. And I just think that the work you're doing is fantastic. But Rachel, it really does speak to the fearlessness with which you come to the tech and media sector too.
I feel like it's a little bit of a misnomer to call me fearless after I just heard those two statements. But
No.
I'll try and spin it.
I've seen you. I've seen you speak powerfully with really no fear, ultimately, about asking why despite the fact that diversity is valued in various different companies, it's not seen as desirable, right? And so you really called people out, had conversations with many leaders in the field about this issue to do with gender. Could you speak to us a little bit about what's motivated that leadership position you've taken?
Sure. So I have called a lot of people out, and if I say out, that's because I'm a Canadian, so I'm with you there. I did not come to this not in a natural way in terms of like always, being interested in feminism and social justice. As I was listening to both of you, I was actually very struck by the contrast of my own upbringing, because now at this sort of stage of my life, I am very conscious of the privilege with which I grew up without sort of realizing it. I mean, I wasn't, I was affluent, suburban, Jewish, Canadian kid, like good schools, dad was a doctor, mom was a lawyer, sort of the expectation was you would go to university and then probably go to law school or business school or med school. It really did seem like those were the only options. I went to law school. It really, as I was listening to you both talk about, the realities of your upbringing and your identity, I was very conscious of the fact that my identity has evolved. And when I look at my life, not to get too philosophical, that identity, I think, was solidified in my 30s, because it was in my 30s that I left law and became a writer without really knowing what that meant. So I left sort of the security of a job that paid well to a completely insecure profession that I had to build from the ground up. And I was a decade later than most of my peers. And so invariably throughout my 30s, my realization of sort of my position and what I've achieved, and sort of juxtaposing that with where my peers that I left behind were, like my high school friends and my law school friends, all advancing apace in their careers and their lives, versus my new career, which were, those whippersnappers in their 20s who were just, leading the way. I was very conscious, I became more and more conscious of the sort of the intertwinedness of age with womanhood and how women are perceived. Because when I hit 34, 35, suddenly the drumbeat of pregnancy, marriage, what are you planning to do with your life, when are you planning to have kids, became pretty relentless. And so before I even came to the feminism side of things in terms of taking on that mantle and somehow having it take over my life, this was becoming my reality. In addition, and this is superimposed on my own feelings, like those sort of like late at night feelings when you're sort of unsure about what you're doing and what your path is, and going through all the Facebook feed of all of your friends and their husbands and babies and being like, okay, what have I done wrong? So this is like, the last few years I've really sort of come up against a lot of this, because as I came more and more to recognizing that women were treated differently, perceived differently, and then I began sort of like looking at everything that I had experienced and recognizing like where I had totally like sailed through without realizing it, which in many ways was a blessing, because it didn't even occur to me that anybody would consider that a liability. Like I was like a pretty bossy kid, like, do you know Wet Hot American Summer, Amy Poehler with the clipboard? Anyone? Like that was me at summer camp. Head of theater, still very proud of my production of Grease 2 in 1994. So one thing that I did start to notice, though, was throughout my various careers, since we're talking about changing lanes, I was a lawyer, I left to be a writer, I sort of like dabbled in comedy, I settled into writing about media and culture, and covered Katie Couric ascending to the anchor chair as the first woman anchor in 2006, Hillary Clinton running for president in 2008, Catherine Bigelow getting the first Best Oscar statuette for a director in, I guess, 2010, I think. I started seeing these commonalities across industries and seeing the same sort of adjectives and qualifiers where women were concerned, and it didn't matter what the industry was. And when I sort of drifted into the tech world, because I was in online media, and so more and more as that evolved, I identified as an online person in the tech space. That was ostensibly defined by merit, and how anybody who could sit in a dorm room and hack out an awesome program could change the world. But it wasn't really like that, because I saw these patterns emerging again and again, and it became very obvious that there were sort of these insidious norms and perceptions that meant that men tended to prefer men, and in the tech world where it's a pretty gated community of access, because the barriers to entry dropped so much that there had to be other ways to sort of for people to figure out who to let in the gate. And so I started pushing back against that, because I was part of this world, and I was looking around and seeing a lot of women doing great stuff and participating in all these companies that were getting all this great cred. But when the time came for recognition, awards, funding, plaudits, those top 25 lists of leaders, like, conference lineups, it was like white dude, white dude, white dude, white dude, white dude, white dude, maybe an Indian dude. And it just, and I was like, okay, like, this is not right. I know it's not right. I see the fact that this is not reflective of reality every day, because I'm now in that reality. Just like I remember feeling the exact same way in media, when there'd be like all these lists of prognosticators for like media predictions for the next year from our top media prognosticators, was like 10 dudes. Like you see it over and over and over and over again in every industry. And so I just started saying so. And I think where privilege is concerned, the very first thing that is necessary to move forward is for the people who are gliding through life in the bubble of that privilege, because it's never occurred to them, like to have that, to be awakened to it. And then once you're awakened to it, it's very difficult not to see it. And so I have been trying to gently awaken people who might not realize that that if you look at things from a different angle or have different perspectives, that maybe things are different. And just to your point about making the point that it's valuable, that there's actually, all of the research suggests that when you have a diverse team, the results are better. You make more money, you make better decisions, you avoid like gaffes, like say calling your game-changing piece of technology iPad, right? Which certainly the day that name was announced, I know I saw a lot of reaction in my Twitter feed, even if the mainstream media didn't necessarily want to note that might be a sort of connotation-riddled name. So it's that sort of bent that I've tried to take to this crusade, and every day get a little better, but just trying to fight the good fight.
Fearless, you see what I mean? Incredible. On this topic of gently changing minds, I heard, Aimee, that you are, I guess, part of a course that Dr. Keene, who was part of your role in coming into this world, teaches at Anaheim and Hershey Medical School, and it's about the X factor, really, right. The way in which the human spirit and the power of resiliency can overcome a lot of different seemingly clear, paths. Could you speak to us a little bit about that? I found that to be powerful.
Sure. Well, that was, Dr. Keene was the man who delivered me. And it was not supposed to be the man who was going to deliver me, but I showed up late and in the wrong city. And so my mom goes into labor. I'm her first child, and this stranger had to tell her that her baby was born without the fibula bones, and the feet didn't fully develop, and they didn't know to what extent there was other damage internally. And basically, I knew the man's name from, it wasn't like my parents talked about what that experience was for them. I mean, my dad's an immigrant from Ireland. It was really, it was kind of like you just didn't talk about these sort of traumatic emotional events, And of course, then once I started having media attention, that's all people wanted to ask me is, what was it like for your parents? I'm like, I don't know, And I tried to ask them, and my father just had his head behind the newspaper, would not discuss it, So a couple years ago, I'm in the town where my parents live in Pennsylvania, and I'm wearing shorts and these legs that my brothers refer to as my RoboCop legs, because there's nothing human, there's no attempt to try to sell it that it's a leg. It's like shock absorbers, and it's black carbon fiber, and boys think they're really cool. Actually, a lot of little girls think they're really cool too now, which is exciting. And so this man's behind me, and he says, well, if it isn't Aimee Mullins. And I was like, who knows I'm here in Allentown, PA, But I forget that, I'm wearing shorts. And, but I don't recognize him. And he's like, it's Dr. Keene. I'm like, oh my God, the man that, delivered me. And we had, after this kind of weird, uncomfortable, acknowledgement of this profound thing that we both sort of shared. I have no memory of it, but he does. He told me, he said, I had to be the person that told your parents you would never walk, you would never run, you'd have no independent mobility, and probably if I had been born, he told me 7 years earlier, they would have recommended institutionalization, which is what they did, not only for people with developmental disabilities, but physical disabilities as well. It was like, this is too hard on you, on your family, put the child away. And he said, I had to be the bearer of this news to your parents, and you've been making a liar out of me ever since. So thank you. And he told me that he had saved everything. I mean, my parents, I don't have any of this scrapbook, but any kind of little victory in my life, or any time I was in the newspaper for, marching with the Girl Scouts and stuff like this, that winning spelling bees, winning a academic scholarship to go to school, making the, track team at Georgetown, and it's incorporated into his classes, that he teaches, and he says, I really try, he's like, it was such a profound moment for me, and I think it's extraordinary when anyone of expertise can acknowledge that they don't know something, that they've been changed, and their view's been changed. He said, I try to tell these young doctors that you cannot account for the power of human will as a determinant in the quality of someone's life. So the prognosis is just that. Understand that you are speculating, and you have to be clear about that. And the idea of what the potential of the human will and what a person may do, and this is where I really take issue with the laziness, to what Dambisa was talking about, of how we get into our need to categorize people rather than treat them and see them as the individuals that they are, and to allow them to have a voice in their own definitions of their own identity. It's not just semantics. It's not just semantics. This is the difference between somebody creating a life that they are the captain of and that they feel proud of and that they can claim, or, you know, somebody that is the product of everyone else's viewpoint, you know, and that is always disempowering. And we do it so casually and without, you know, without regret oftentimes, that we don't, that we you know, we know we're doing this and we continue to perpetrate these categorizations of people that have real impact on how these people feel they can perform in their life.
I'm going to open up to questions in a few minutes, but I thought just on this topic of really labels and the need to get away from them. And Dambisa, if you might speak to us about that. I saw you mention to The Guardian recently that one of the beauties of an African identity was that you don't do labels well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, if you think about it, and having been raised in Africa, that is an example of probably one of the most successful PR campaigns. You've convinced 1 billion people, in fact, you've convinced more than 1 billion people that not only are they not able to contribute to the betterment of the world, but you've actually been able to convince other people in other places that are living in more impoverished environments that they are better than Africans. And I cannot tell you, I mean, I've been so fortunate, I've traveled to over 50 countries around the world, and I cannot tell you how many times, even in desperately poor places I visited in India or in South America, in rural China, people, they turn to me when they find out I'm African, and they want to talk to me with this sense of pity or concern. Oh, Rita, you're from Africa. Oh, that's really sad to hear that. And it actually, rather than get upset about it, I thought, gosh, it's a brilliant PR campaign to convince Africans that they are incapable, but also to convince everybody else. Even I've been in meetings where a Chinese policymaker will have me sitting right there, will look right past me and talk to an American and say, what should we do about Africa? And I think this is absolute insanity, but talk about a brilliant campaign. But you know what I will say more generally is last night I went to this awards dinner, and I was absolutely blown away, as you can imagine, by the recipient. One of the recipients was Aung San Suu Kyi, and she said something which I thought was so profound. I kept saying to her, I've got to remember to say this here. She said, nobody should, I'm paraphrasing, she was much more eloquent than I am, but she said, no one should feel sorry for me. She goes, I made a choice. I made a choice in my life about what I wanted to do and how I wanted to be. And you know, I went home thinking about that, and I thought, she's so right. And the choice is a difficult choice to make. It's so much easier for me to be, I don't know, and one of my favorite things is I should just go back home and become a corrupt African politician and steal money. That would be easier than for me to try and convince people who feel they're doing the right thing that aid is not the solution. It's so much easier to say, oh, you know what, I come from a affluent background. I'm sure your parents, like my parents, they wheel out very quote-unquote eligible gentlemen. It would be so much easier to have, so much easier to just meet a nice doctor, a nice lawyer, marry him, stay home, and have children, and conform to broader society. And by the way, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's the road less traveled. And ultimately, we have to decide that when we take our last breaths, we have to be the ones to say, you know what, I did the best I could for the life that the cards I was dealt. And we should not be apologetic to anyone. You know, I go to bed resting very easy, knowing that I've said something that I really believe in. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not, the oracle, but I really believe in what I say. And, we all ought to believe that. And and again, one of the things that Colin Powell said is, we oughtn't be victims of how other people perceive us. If throughout my life growing up in Africa, it would have been easy for me to hang up my shoes. I come from a small country. The population of my country is about 10 million people. It's, they could have said, oh, you're black, you're a woman, you're from Africa, a small country. There was a whole list of reasons I couldn't be here today. But if you listen to those people, those naysayers, which, by the way, they still exist. They're all around us. Some of them are in our family. Some of them are friends. Some of them are media. You won't do anything. And Colin Powell's phrase is, don't fight other people's battles. That's their problem. It's not my problem. And you have to live with yourself. And the very last thing I'll say is, one of my favorite quotes is something that Teddy Roosevelt said, and it's called "The Man in the Arena," and it's absolutely brilliant. And I won't say everything that he says, but the last sentence has something to do with, again, once more, he was much more eloquent than I am, but he said that whatever happens, you should know and you should aspire for your place to not be with those cold and timid souls who will never know victory or defeat. And ultimately, there will be challenges and there will be failures and disappointments, and of course, there'll be a whole lot of critics. But just make sure that when you breathe your last breath, you're not in that group of people who will never know victory or defeat. Thank you.
I want to make sure we have some time for questions from the audience, if there are any. And if there are, I see a hand on the left and someone coming down. Let's take the mic.
Hi, my name is Dominique House. I'm a final semester urban policy student here at the New School. I just wanted to say that I think that this conversation epitomizes what I expected out of this entire conference. I salute you women for being so courageous and rooted in your integrity, right? And conviction, and to be so fearless to tell your stories and testimonies. Because I think in the bigger picture, what's more important is not about the individual work that we do, but how it impacts and influences other people's lives. So like when you're writing, or when you're speaking, or when you're running, or tweeting, or whatever you're doing, I think sometimes we lose sight of the receiver, the potential reader, the potential watcher, and yeah, so there's people watching you, and I'm a regular around the way girl who has big dreams of like changing the world, and I'm sitting in this urban policy program at Milano, and I'm frustrated for a lot of reasons, and thank God it's my final semester. But I just came back from Uganda, and one of the prerequisites was that we sit in a class called Urbanization in Africa. And of course, there's me, the only black American student in the class, and then there's an African woman in the class, and then that Indian, and then there's a Latino. But the majority of the class, it was a predominantly white class, which is fine. But I don't think we had enough conversation, and I told my professor, who worked at the World Bank in the past, that we didn't have the conversation about what it means for this entire class to travel abroad and go help East Africa, right? This notion of help really threw me off. So he's like, Dominique, you should read this book called Dead Aid. I read the book, and it changed my life.
You must get it.
I know, it's an amazing book. Oh my God. It changed my life. So thank you so, so much. And it kind of steers all of my work, outside of class, professionally, personally, domestically, internationally, that it's not about help, it's actually about collaboration. And, just more of a bottom-up, it just changed my life. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
I appreciate it. So I think we all appreciate it. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Can I just say really quickly, it sounds like you're not having the greatest time here for your last year, but you're in school, and just take this year. You've like so many people at your disposal, so many things you can do. I loved school so much, like that you can just do anything you want and talk to anybody. You can use being a student as an excuse to do and reach out to anyone, so just do that. That's all.
Thank you. So I wanted to thank all of you. It was a fantastic discussion. I have a question that's more around the lines of sort of leadership, and I think much of what you've spoken about is about empathy. It's about having people see you, seeing other people, and really connecting, and I think putting yourself in the shoes of others. And I think many of my experiences, that's what's changed me. And so I'm curious, does that resonate with you? Do you think empathy is important, and how has it played a role in your life? And do you think it can be taught or learned?
I absolutely think empathy is a crucial component of leadership, of successful leadership. I think that's actually why, to your point of the change of the ratio, Rachel, they know in all these studies where there's, half of a company's board are women, that, there are certain traits, not all women have it, not all men have it, but, people who have empathy have that innate ability to understand, if they don't understand someone else's perspective, to acknowledge it and to elevate it to importance. That someone else's perspective is why they're a good problem solver. That someone else's absolutely unique individual experience is an asset. And they don't need to conform into a way of thinking, cult of the company kind of thing. And I know certainly some of the people, I've been self-employed since I got out of college, employed to various degrees, as my parents loved to point out. But I was financially on my own since I was 17, and that the people that have mentored me in various ways, and I've had the privilege of sitting on boards with some extraordinary men and women, I feel that empathy is that characteristic that I see in all of them. It's what allows you to say the thing that needs to be said, sometimes to embolden somebody that may not feel they have the place to say it. And it allows you to always keep, I think, a healthy sense of, I don't know if this is going to come off right, but being an outsider. I think there's something really important to leadership about not feeling like you can be on the fringes and looking on the edges of the horizon of what's known and what is accepted as fact, and to understand that that's all we know right now. It doesn't mean that's what is or what can be. That kind of insight, I think, comes from having empathy.
Great. I think we have one more question there from June.
Thank you, Sarah. Can I just say what an awesome panel. You ladies rock. Wow. Sort of touching on what you've all sort of said today, and in particular you, Aimee. One of the things that my dad, who's in the audience here somewhere, always said to us growing up was question what you believe. And I think that's one of the things as human beings that we don't do enough of, questioning what it is that we believe and whether or not it serves us well. So what I love about what you said, Aimee, about the doctors is actually, it's a good thing to be wrong because, that's how you learn and that's how you grow. And I think what you've all done for us today is make us sort of even question the beliefs that we have ourselves, because yes, we're all women here, and we know what it means to have to sort of try to break through a glass ceiling, but there's a lot of this stuff that we even do. So it's how we get beyond that and actually question the stuff that we believe and whether or not this is actually serving us as humanity, as a sort of human race. So thank you so much for a really profound conversation today. Thank you.
I'm told we have time for one more question. And I see one on the left from that gentleman there. Ah, perfect.
Well, I just wanted to say one thing. I really appreciate everything that all of you had to say this morning. And I wanted to say that women are actually fighting a battle that they've already won. And the reason why I say that, you hear all kinds of, let's fight for our rights. There's not too many women inclusion on this board, in this room, in this place. But when you look around, there will not be a single man without a woman. Every man in the boardroom was at some point raised by a woman. So my view is simply this. Rather than try to go to the men to fight for your positions, start with the mothers. Start with the wives, because every man listens to his mother or his wife. And if the wife can convince the husband that you are in a position to affect the place women have in society. So when you are in the boardrooms, realize that without some woman, you wouldn't be there. And therefore, if you look at the society, women play a role. They play the nourishing role. And how could someone bring out somebody, nourish them, and at the same time be put on the back end? So I just wanted to say that, in short, start with your sons, with your husbands, and you wouldn't have to fight for your place in life.
Can I just respond to that really briefly? All of what you say is true in terms of men in boardrooms of power would not be there without women. That is the starting point, in my view, and I feel like it's an issue that it's best addressed on multiple fronts. So while definitely the messaging of individual women to individual men is certainly useful and hopefully goes on and will continue to go on, what I'm interested in on a professional basis for women is power and money, frankly, because those are the two things that elude women the most in the society, that when women find it more difficult to ask for money, they're socialized not to ask for money, they're socialized, they get less money, and the same thing goes with power. So I'm being greedy. I want everything you said and more for women. So power and money.
Yes. Okay. Well, today I thought we were going to speak about reinvention. We've done that and far more. I will say one thing I didn't expect, and I'm so thrilled that we could do, is what is most hard to do, and that is to talk about how we can learn to see the other in ourselves. And I think Blair Miller's, brilliant question about that goes to the heart of empathy and leadership. And you three do that so powerfully, beautifully. And I thank all of you for taking part in what I think is just a fantastic conversation. I'm honored to moderate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.